Will the ghost of 6-year-old Mary finally be laid to rest? The final chapter of The Kingdom here on BBC Two at 11:30. Before that, Newsnight.
It's the big unargued issue of the election. Which party would best look after our interests in Europe? On Newsnight tonight, we debate the biggest of all the questions facing Britain. A question which will not be resolved once and for all by this election, but what sort of a government we choose on May the 1st will make a huge difference not just to us, but perhaps for hundreds of millions of others. The issue is Europe, and the questions: 1, do we want to join a single currency? 2, do we want to lift our opt-out on European legislation like the social chapter? 3, should we, can we reinvent a Europe of trading nation-states? We've the 3 big party spokesmen, we've the man who became the referendum party's first MP, we've Conservatives who take diametrically opposed views on Europe, and we investigate how the personal manifestos of some Conservative candidates are not following the careful cabinet line. We'll hear from the Labour voices who aren't towing their current party line either, and men and women who run businesses and work for them argue their case. It's 5 years to the day since the last election. At a rally in Plymouth tonight, Tony Blair claimed he now had proof that the average household was paying more of its income in tax than it was then. It came in an independent report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. John Major shot back that the average family was now £1,100 a year better off. But while they appeal to our wallets, each knows that 6 weeks after the election, whoever is British Prime Minister is going to have to go to the European Summit in Amsterdam. There he'll have to fight Britain's corner in a meeting which may do much to shape the future of Europe. The 2 key issues are the single currency and the social chapter. On the single currency, both the Tories and Labour say they'll wait to see how it shapes up before deciding whether to join, while the Lib Dems want to go ahead. All 3 parties will hold a referendum to approve any decision to join. On the social chapter, the Tories who negotiated Britain's opt-out at Maastricht will stay out. Labour will sign up, but say any new measures under the chapter must maintain Britain's competitiveness. The Lib Dems are fully in favour of the social chapter. Now, the parties would like us all to believe that there is one on this as on every other issue. It's not true. Even the Liberal Democrats have their mavericks, Labour's split, and so are the Conservatives. Mark Mardell reports.
Right, Peter, here we are, the final ones from the printers.
All right, thanks.
Conservative personal manifestos feature wives, kids, a potted biography, and it seems in this election, scathing attacks on the European Union. In this safe-ish Yorkshire seat, they think the government should have gone further and opposed a single currency. It won't, so they will.
Right, they have put in the bit we wanted about toughening up on Europe here. We're saying that we are against the abolition of the pound sterling and against the single currency.
Is this open rebellion against the government line in the middle of a general election?
I think I may be going further than the government, but that's allowed within the policy framework. We haven't got a fixed policy of saying we're in favour of the single currency. In fact, quite the reverse. I mean, we're very, very sceptical of a single European currency, and I'm just going a little bit further and saying, no, I will never support a single currency.
But you are saying if they did decide to go in, if there was a Conservative government and they decided to go in, you wouldn't vote with them?
Well, I am saying that, but I don't believe for 1 minute that that's what they would say.
Here in Yorkshire, they're off to a very early start. Many candidates won't publish their personal manifestos for another 10 days or so. But Newsnight has managed to get hold of some of the very first examples of such documents, and they're pretty uncomfortable reading for the government. On Europe, strong meat indeed. It seems all round the country there are would-be Conservative MPs who are willing to openly defy the party line on Europe.
And most far-reaching manifesto.
The Tory manifesto merely declares that it's best to keep Britain's options open, negotiate and then decide. But candidates in every conceivable type of seat are being less coy. Sir Peter Tapsell shows a picture of Chancellor Cole labelled Annexed Leader. He declares, I give you this pledge, I shall never vote to join a single European currency. Lawrence Robertson, in the Conservative Marginal, calls the EU a socialist superstate. He writes, this dictatorship is not acceptable and proclaims, Rule Britannia, I will vote against the single European currency. Under the heading No Surrender, in virtually identical leaflets, 3 senior MPs in the last Parliament, Sir Ivan Lawrence, Barry Legg and John Townend, answer the question how a single currency would damage Britain. Newsnight has seen or been told by candidates of 22 other examples of election literature which runs counter to party policy. One well-known rebel, Tony Marlow, has declared, "I will fight to keep the British pound. Were it to be surrendered, then the greatest nation that the world has known would cease to exist."
Given that there is no conclusion in principle, I think it's perfectly reasonable for individual candidates to say, well, as a backbencher of the new Parliament, I would want to influence the government to say no.
50.
Is it just malcontents who'd smile on such behaviour? The High Command certainly seems powerless. Robert Kinghorn bucks the government line by saying he would never vote for a single currency. But his election address, like many others, was printed by Central Office. They interfered in some things, but not Europe.
They suggested I drop the word doctor from my name. They suggested or asked me to consider whether I wanted to put the fact that my wife and I are regular churchgoers in, whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. It was presentational, not political advice that I was given. There was no problem at all at Central Office with the language that I used on Europe, on the single currency, in what I put in at all.
Certainly, the bulk of it was actually with Central Office at the end of October.
Central Office got involved early, sending out dummy leaflets, but the Joe Blogs template doesn't run to suggested smooth words on a single currency. Senior sources have told Newsnight they knew discipline could not have been enforced. Chaos would have resulted.
Did they have any niggles at all? I mean, these are all about... No, I mean...
So spelling mistakes are corrected, pure heresy is printed. The government has ruled out a referendum on Britain's place within the EU. Many candidates do not. Lawrence Robertson says, "I will vote to hold a full referendum on Britain's future role in Europe." And Peter Bone writes in his, "The British people must decide through a referendum on Britain's future relationship with Europe."
Yeah, I think we should have a referendum on the future of our relationship with Europe. I think that's going to be the big question of the next 5 years. I mean, I don't think such a big issue has arisen since the end of the Second World War, when the German and Italian fascists were goose-stepping their way across Western Europe.
But that is quite specifically against Conservative policy. John Major has quite specifically rejected the idea of such a referendum.
Well, all I'm saying is I think the arguments will develop to such a stage that through the negotiations or the change in the Maastricht Treaty, that there will have to be a referendum.
Mr Major's problems are just beginning. Reliable Eurosceptic sources have told me 150 candidates in safe Tory seats have signed up to say no to a single currency. The Prime Minister's real headache will be if any ministers join them. He's already said he'd sack them. Neither backing down nor infuriating Eurosceptics would exactly be a brilliant idea.
Malcolm Rifkind, why don't you admit that there is really precious little chance of you're ever getting a parliamentary party to vote for a single currency in the event that you won a majority in the government anyway?
Well, we have not taken the view necessarily that we wish to join a single currency. What you're telling me is that there are a number of our candidates who have already reached a conclusion. That's not just true in the Conservative Party. 50 Labour MPs issued a document attacking Robin Cook and Tony Blair on the single currency some months ago. So, yes, there is these internal points of view in each of the parties.
But these positions, as expressed by your candidates, are completely at odds with what is your official policy.
No, they're not actually, because, you know, I've spoken to some... Well, let me explain. I've spoken to some of the candidates. What they say is, my personal view, one or two of them say, is I'm against the single currency, but I recognise and respect that the government has to look at the wider national interest, and that national interest will require a decision towards the end of the year.
So when somebody says that he will never vote for the abolition of the pound and never support a single European currency, that is somehow not at odds with your position that you might recommend that we do go.
I think Tony Benn or Peter Shaw would say the same, so would Austin Mitchell.
That's neither here nor there, whether others are inconsistent.
Well, if you're telling me there are individual people in my party who will always be against a single currency, that is not the most breathtaking revelation of the year. And is the fact is we've known that for a long time.
And it's quite consistent for this candidate here in Yorkshire to say that there should be a referendum on Britain's future relationship with Europe.
Well, that individual candidate is putting himself before the electorate. He is the electorate entitled to know his views.
So it's quite all right for him to say that there should be a referendum on the whole question of the future relationship with Europe, not specifically on the single currency.
The whole point of an individual document produced by a candidate is they explain their views. Now, of course, we have a situation in the Labour Party as in the Conservative Party, where on the issue of a single currency, there are individual MPs who take a view different to their official party position. That's not new, it's not unknown.
But these are documents printed by Central Office. approved by central office.
Look, we don't impose ourselves on local constituencies.
But
hold on, you asked me a question, I'm going to answer it. The fact is that we believe that the local candidate is responsible to the local electorate. Right. They decide who their MP should be. It is the Labour Party, I have to say, who acts in a rather Stalinist fashion, trying to impose a rigid, unthinking discipline, regardless of the strongly held convictions of individual MPs and candidates.
Edwina, Currie, you're all at 6s and 7s, aren't you?
Well, there will be one or two who have always taken that view. I think Peter Tapsell, for example, has always been rather hostile to that kind of development.
Oh, yeah, he's got a picture of Chancellor Cole in his election address talking about him as our next leader, question mark.
Oh, goodness, he is a Christian Democrat, of course, but it's a different election. But some of the others, I suspect their allegiance to a particular Eurosceptic point of view is at least part because perhaps they thought that was the way to get selected. When it comes to the crunch, if the party leadership is in favour, if it looks like a good thing for our country, I'm quite sure that they will accept the whip and they'll march to the right lobby.
The significance of this, of course, beyond the knockabout Malcolm Rifkind, is that the suggestion that the reason your party is taking the line that it is taking is not that it's necessarily anything to do with Britain's interests, but that it is to do with somehow trying to hold the party together.
No, that's simply not true. Look, the nation has to come to a judgment on a single currency. As with all other European countries, that decision is going to be taken next March, is the likely date. Before then, it is necessary to assess what is the national interest. Some members of Parliament in all parties have already reached a view on that. They reached a personal conclusion. But what most Conservatives say is either that they are very content with the government's policy, or they are relaxed about it on the basis that they recognise the government has to judge the national interest and then come to a conclusion.
Teresa Gorman, what are you going to say in your personal address about a single currency?
I'm going to tell my electors that I will never vote to do away with the pound, because that is what they overwhelmingly want me to do.
So you're saying there is no inconsistency between the manifesto which you support, which says that the national interest is not exercised by our exercising our option one way or the other, and you're deciding to exercise that option one way.
No, I'm not. I'm simply telling my constituents at this time where my sentiments lie. I think I owe it to them to let them know what I feel about that.
Right, let's move on a little bit then. Now, Elmar Brok joining us from Germany. Can Britain stay out of a single currency?
I think it's a British decision. I believe that it's in the long run against British interest. The internal market can only develop really, especially for the small and medium-sized companies, with a common currency. And I believe that Britain would be a perfect member for that, because it's in the interest of British export industry and in the interest of the importance of the City of London, and therefore it would make sense for Britain to join. We would like that Britain would join, but it's up to Britain to decide.
Right, let's just be clear. As far as you know, no one knows for certain yet, will the single currency go ahead?
I think after the meeting in Nordwijk this weekend, it's absolutely sure that the single currency will come. There will be enough countries who will meet the criteria in the sense of the Maastricht Treaty, and I think there's so much commitment in so many governments and parliaments. And it's already decided in referenda together with the Maastricht Treaty and in ratification processes in national parliaments that I have no doubt anymore that the single currency will come.
Robin Cook, would you be happy to be out of that single currency?
Well, we have decided we'll make a decision in Britain's interest, and if we come to the right decision and what's in the interest of Britain, I'll be very happy with that. We will take a hard-headed economic assessment of will it be in Britain's interest, will there be more British jobs if we join, or if we stay out. That is the basis in which we have always approached this question, and the basis in which we will continue to do so.
And just so we know where you're standing, Charles Kennedy, would you be happy for Britain to be out, assuming that it does go ahead in 1999?
No, I wouldn't, providing that we meet the criteria and that the criteria aren't fudged, and that we've had a positive vote from the referendum. I very much want Britain to be in. And if indeed we had a government recommendation to vote yes, and the people voted no, and the currency went ahead, we could have joined it, but we chose not to, I think this country, economically, would be a poorer place as a result.
Malcolm Rifkind, do you think that the Labour Party's position is now more or less indistinguishable from yours?
No, I think it's extremely different, and I'll tell you why. Robin Cook, a few weeks ago, said that if a single currency happens, if it seems to be working for France and Germany, then it's almost certain Britain would have to join. I think that's totally the wrong approach. It may work for France and Germany. That's for France and Germany to concern themselves with. What we have to judge is not only what are the implications for jobs and for our economy, but whether any benefits to Britain would justify the permanent loss of national decision-making, not just on the single currency question, but on the matters that flow from that, interest rates, for example. At the moment, mortgage rates, which are linked to interest rates. So these are pretty basic questions, and that is why, because a single currency is not just a temporary phenomenon, it is a permanent loss of our currency and the control that goes with it. You would have to have a pretty high onus of proof satisfied to justify such a loss of national control.
Ourselves and the Conservative Party. The first is we're going to base our decision on economic common sense and economic reality. It's quite clear from those cases you quoted that these people are going to decide it by their emotion and by their dogma, and the government and the front bench of the Tory party is going to be driven by their faction fighting. Secondly, we do provide a clear, coherent shadow cabinet line. Everybody in the leadership agreed. You will not find 50 or 150 Labour MPs standing on a line opposed to the front bench. The Conservative wait-and-see policy has become a say-what-you-like policy.
Well, actually, that's not quite true. 50 Labour MPs may have been bullied into being silent, may have been told that they can't attend programmes like this. But we know that there are 50 Labour MPs because they published their names 6 months ago before they were sat upon by Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson, who attacked you, Robin, and attacked Tony Blair on the single currency issue.
Okay, there will not be 50 Labour MPs attacking us in the election address. They will be standing on the Labour Party platform and they will vote for Labour policy.
Right.
We have a coherent Conservative Party that can't even get its own MPs to support its own.
Well, I'd like to hear from our correspondent, Mark Mardell, who is down at Westminster, about whether there is indeed consistency in the Labour Party. Does Labour have a similar problem to the Tories, Mark?
Yeah, let's try and get this straight. They don't have a similar problem in the sense that Europe is, as a whole issue, doesn't have that symbolic poignancy that it does for the Tories. But there is one crucial issue, and that is the issue of the single currency, which really does go to the heart of the divide between new and old Labour. If you remember, the Labour Party in the past opposed what was then the common market because they said it would lead to, it was about a banker's Europe. And many of those in the Labour Party who would still call themselves socialists do object to a single currency because they say it's the very point of socialism is that politicians should have control over the levers of economic power, and that's giving them up to bankers. Now, what evidence do we have about the level of opposition? Well, more Labour MPs did vote against Maastricht than Tories, 66 Labour MPs, and there were 41 Tories. Some of those are retiring, but at least 40 Labour Euro rebels are likely to be re-elected this time. And as Malcolm Rifkind said, last year 50 Labour MPs sponsored the Europe Isn't Working campaign. And they're already painting the banners for a march by anti-Euro Labour MPs to the Intergovernmental Conference in June. And members of the campaign group have told Newsnight that on May the 2nd they believe there'll be a Labour government, and from then onwards they will be pressurising Robin Cook to build what they call a people's Europe.
Well, why aren't we hearing anything much from them now?
Well, the iron discipline of New Labour is fabled, isn't it? And it's certainly true that I've spoken to quite a few MPs, or former now MPs, on the left, who say we mustn't do anything to lose this election, we mustn't do anything to rock the boat. But it works both ways as well, because we did find a senior Labour figure who's very much a Eurosceptic, who would have come on this programme to debate, but Robin Cook isn't willing to debate with him, isn't willing to sit down with him, so we can't do that. But nevertheless, over the last couple of days, we have found two MPs who are willing to put their distinctive view to the programme.
Well, I think the Eurosceptics are great in numbers, and I think we have a concern about economics, whereas the Tories are concerned much more about nationalism. So I think there's a difference there, but it depends how quickly and how soon and how far a Labour government pushes the issue. My feeling is they won't push it at all far. I think the single country will be disastrous for Labour because our policy all depends on expansion, and we can't therefore afford cuts in government spending for Maastricht. We can't afford the exchange rate mechanism. We can't afford to hand over control of interest rates. So I think for Labour, a single currency is out.
We need to take the decision in 1998, but there will be costs if we decide to stay out. If we were outside the single currency, there are dangers of speculation against our currency. If we are on our own with a big European bloc against us with perhaps 10 member states, and we are not part of any other global currency system, then we could be subject to the vagaries of the market and speculation and have to have higher interest rates than we would otherwise have had, perhaps 2-3% higher in this country, and that has economic costs.
Robin Cook, which of those two do you agree with?
I have to say that I agree with the Labour Party policy, Jeremy, and it's the Labour Party policy that Michael Gapes will be supporting. Can I just look at back? There are some things that I have to put right there. First of all, on the question of not appearing in this programme with another Labour MP, I have never appeared in a television studio with another Labour MP since 1983, and I have no intention of starting for the convenience of Newsnight. The Tory party may become so accustomed to being divided to do it regularly. We don't do it, and we're not going to start doing it.
Isn't this an important enough issue for you to do? The whole future of this country, the future of our currency, you're still not prepared to discuss with not just any Labour MP. We were also told you wouldn't appear with any Labour MEP, any member of the House of Lords who belongs to the Labour Party, or even Labour councillors.
Jeremy, I've made the point to you already. I have not appeared with colleagues to debate in the studio of party policy because I believe that there's matters we should debate inside the party, and we have done so. We have debated our party policy at our conferences in each of the last 3 years, and in each of those last 3 years we have put our policy to our conference, it has been voted upon, it has been carried overwhelmingly.
What is happening this evening, Robin, it really demonstrates to the public what New Labour is all about. We've been told Labour MPs who disagree with you refuse to have any discussion with them in front of the public. The public are not allowed to know that Labour MPs disagree with you. We have Labour MPs who are against the single currency. They're not allowed to say that to their own constituents.
We debate our policy within our party. Our conference is transmitted. Our conference is open. No, our conference is not Stalinist. If I may say so, there is a Stalinist conference around it that's also in the Conservative Party one. Our conference is an open one. But having made a policy decision, then we are not going to have a situation in which that policy...
Which anyone is allowed to rock the boat. But I mean, the contrast, of course, is with your party, where anyone's allowed to say more or less anything.
Oh, no,
and then stand for Parliament.
No, of course not. We have a party policy, but we respect the fact that there are individual MPs who disagree with Teresa. Takes a different view to me. I don't mind appearing with us so the public can know that it's a proper debate.
I'd like to move on to the substance of this, if you don't mind.
The point
I'd like to ask you, Sir Clive Thompson, you are the boss of a very big company. Do you believe that politicians in this country are addressing the single currency issue in a sufficiently serious way, in a way that does it justice?
The answer to that is no. I think this is probably one of the biggest issues that's going to face this country in the next 20 years, and for it to be debated in this way at this particular time of the electoral cycle, I think is particularly inappropriate. I think it's impossible to discuss the single currency in soundbite terms without moving back and to consider the single market and the benefits of the single market. One point I would make, which is the fact that all countries within the European Union, and we have, within my business, active subsidiaries within every country in the European Union, all those countries have these types of problems. We're talking here about patriotism, and this is not a patriotic issue. The benefits of the single market are simply that it represents 40% of the world's trade, and therefore for us to cut ourselves away from a single market is foolish. To be part of the single currency is an extension of the single market.
The single market could function without a single currency, couldn't it?
It could, but in practical terms it won't, because there will be a single currency.
Right. George Gardiner, you say there are no circumstances under which you would join a single currency. You say those questions, the questions behind that are more important than the arguments that you've heard.
Oh yes, I mean, I regard this very much as a patriotic matter. I mean, I disagree very much with the Labour Party's position here, that this is a judgment that has to be weighed up purely on the economic pros and cons. I mean, doesn't the question of protecting our sovereignty arise here? And equally, I'm afraid I disagree with my old friend Malcolm here, in that he and the Conservative manifesto are trying to have it both ways. They're saying on the one hand that they're going to maintain Britain as a nation state, and yet they are prepared to consider surrendering the pound, surrendering control of our own interest rates, and eventually of our taxation.
Charles Kennedy, you accept, do you, that it would involve, whatever the advantages, it would involve a loss of sovereignty?
Without any shadow of a doubt. I don't think that anybody looking at an issue as profound as this could argue otherwise. What you've got to do is set it in the historical context. There was a profound loss of sovereignty after the Second World War when we put our name to something called NATO, where we linked our nuclear defence, our very existence, to other countries, a large number, two of which were on the other side of the Atlantic. There was a loss of sovereignty in joining the common market. There was a loss of sovereignty in passing the Maastricht Treaty.
Sir Clive Thompson, why is that loss of sovereignty acceptable for a commercial benefit?
I don't see that there is such a loss of sovereignty. The three economic levers of power for any government are interest rates, exchange rates, and taxation. We effectively lost our sovereignty in terms of interest rates and exchange rates 20, 30 years ago. Our interest rates and our exchange rates are a function of international trade. Our taxation with a European Union and the mobility of labour is inevitably going to go converge. And therefore, I would argue the points about economic sovereignty don't exist.
Now, Mrs. Ewing, you're joining us from Edinburgh. I know you think that the question of sovereignty was seated a long time ago at the Act of Union, and indeed probably before that. But given that you would seek in an ideal world an independent Scotland, why would you be prepared to concede the question of Scottish sovereignty on, in Inverness, why would you be prepared to concede the idea of sovereignty for a sovereign Scotland once you'd thrown off the yoke of the English?
Well, I'm glad that you recognise I'm speaking from the Highland capital, but you're asking me the basic question about what is sovereignty. And sovereignty is something that I've always defined within the context of the Helsinki Agreement, which is sovereignty is the right of a nation to pool its own rights for the greater good of other communities and other nations. And I think that is the direction in which the world has been moving since the Second World War. And I mean, when we're talking about the single currency, the pound sterling was tied to the Deutschmark rate for years, for decades. And the idea that somehow or other this change is going to be something totally different. I do think it is a big issue nonetheless, and I don't think any of us should underestimate that. And I think that what I've been listening to as I've been sitting here in Inverness is an argument which doesn't seem to me to have taken an informed opinion. There's lots of attitudes being thrown around from both sides, and I think what is really needed is a major impact assessment of that, so that when people do take the decision, it is actually one which is an informed viewpoint and not based on particular biases which come from whichever direction.
Now, the difficulty, Robin Cook, that a lot of voters have is that neither you nor indeed the Conservatives will tell us where you stand as a question of principle on whether this is an acceptable thing to do for some greater good, to lose the sovereignty.
Jeremy, I have answered your question earlier on. We have said we do believe, and I disagree with George Gardiner, this is profoundly an economic decision. You cannot defend your sovereignty if you were to take a decision which you believed weakened your economy. We have spelt out the criteria in which we will judge that, criteria that look particularly at the impact on the economy and on jobs. We have also said, should we decide to go in, there will be a referendum of the British people so that they will have the real veto. Now, that is the position on which we are going into this election. As Malcolm Rifkind said earlier, the decision on this does not need to be taken and cannot be taken until 1998. It would be wrong now to take a decision which must be based on the economic facts of the time.
Teresa Gorman, do you find your party's position on this principled?
Of course I do. The government is saying that it is keeping an open
Nothing
mind,
more important than
that
sovereignty,
it
surely.
is extremely sceptical about the idea of doing away with our pound, and it will give the people a vote on this should it decide that that is in our best interest.
Could I add
That
to
is
that?
a fair and open position.
And could I add to that, we don't take the view that the single currency is purely an economic question. There are constitutional and political implications for sovereignty, and that is why I said a few moments ago that you would have to be satisfied, as we were with NATO, that there was such an overriding national interest that justified sharing our defence with the United States and with other European countries. That test was satisfied in the case of NATO. For it to be satisfied in the case of the single currency will be difficult, but it's not impossible. We would have to be satisfied there were such enormous benefits to our economy that could only be achieved in that way. If that test could not be satisfied, then it would be wrong in principle to join a single currency and hand over your sovereignty in important areas unless you could demonstrate to the people of this country the major benefits. And because you would never get it back, it's an important point. Because it's irreversible, in effect, there's a very large onus of proof that has to be satisfied before you cede sovereignty in that way.
So we're going to take a look at something else now, because although you still do hear people quaintly talking about the common market, what we actually belong to is the European Union. It has all sorts of powers beyond mere trading and ambitions for a whole lot more. At Maastricht, John Major negotiated a British right not to be part of the so-called social chapter, which is the way the rest of Europe makes regulations about things like conditions of people's work. So far, only two specific measures have been agreed. The Works Council's directive instructs that employees of large Europe-wide companies be consulted in the workplace, but only if they choose to be. And the other key measure is an entitlement to up to 3 months unpaid parental leave for childcare. Labour say they'll sign up to the social chapter. Here are the views of two people on the rights and wrongs of that idea.
I'm Pat O'Regan, a trained craftsman repairing electricity meters for United Utilities, and I believe we should sign on to the social chapter. One clear advantage would be legislation to ensure large companies have a works council where management, staff representatives and the unions meet on a regular basis. This prevents the workforce from being excluded from the decision-making process and crucial matters that affect our working lives. Increasingly, companies like United Utilities are recognising the value of works councils, but the decision for some companies to have one should not be optional. The social chapter is about getting minimum standards. Take, for example, the right for parents to have unpaid leave. Like many of my colleagues, I'm a parent and know the pressures of bringing up children. If we believe in strong family values, then why shouldn't British parents have the right to share the responsibility for childcare? The social chapter is the way forward for a genuine partnership between employers and employees. It helps to ensure we get the benefits from our membership of the European Union and the single market. How can any working person not want to be part of a process which gives them the same rights as fellow workers in Europe?
I'm Mike Fisher, chairman of Whale Tankers, a manufacturing company here in the West Midlands, and I'm opposed to Britain signing up to the social chapter. Take maternity or paternity leave. Placing more legal requirements on firms to keep people's jobs open sounds a great idea, but in practice it just doesn't make sense. 90% of all companies have less than 10 employees, where each one has a key position. How can companies hold open an important post? They cannot. Somebody has to do the work. We have to remain flexible. Works councils are just as constrictive. They are fine in principle, but shouldn't be forced on companies. They will create problems which aren't there. Legal disputes about when, where, how often, and who should take part in them. It's a headache we can do without. What UK Limited needs is fuller employment. That is the only way to achieve lasting good conditions. And the way to achieve fuller employment is to reduce its cost, not increase it as with the social chapter. Just look what has happened on the continent. Increased employment costs, unemployment rises, and jobs are exported. The great danger is that social unrest will follow. And that is exactly where the social chapter will take us. Right back to where we were in the 1970s.
Lord Wolfson, Robin Cook wants to sign up to the social chapter. Would you like to tell him what you think the consequences of that would be?
Well, it's totally unnecessary. If Robin Cook were in government and the legislation passed under the social chapter was good for Britain, we can enact it ourselves. If, on the other hand, it was bad for Britain, we don't have to enact it. We've got a very, very valuable opt-out. If they do foolish things, and they may well do, then we don't have to take them. If they do sensible things, if we want to pass minimum wage legislation, we can do it ourselves. If we want to demand works councils, we can do it ourselves. There is absolutely no point in accepting the unknown for being imposed on us when we can actually pick and choose. And therefore the opt-out should continue. And if we want to enact legislation, let's do it on our own.
So your objection is that he's doing something that's unnecessary?
It's unnecessary and potentially very damaging, because if Europe passes social chapter legislation which is damaging to Britain, then we would have to accept it if we cancel the opt-out. If we've got the opt-out, we can pass the legislation if we think it's good, and we cannot pass the legislation if we think it's bad.
And just as a matter of interest, I mean, roughly how many people do you employ?
I would think 20-odd thousand, but I
right.
suspect...
I mean, a man who employs 20-odd thousand people, Robin Cook, ought to know what he's talking about, shouldn't he?
Yes, and I found it very interesting that he wasn't able to produce a single example of something that's damaging at present under the social chapter. And if you take the case of the European Works Council, it is not possible to have a law on European Works Council that passed simply in one country, because the whole point of that directive is that it bites on companies that have plants in more than one country. And I have to say, Joe, if I could just finish my point, if I can retain your attention for a second.
Well,
I have to say that the great majority of the people who work for the gentleman you've interviewed may well feel that having the same rights of information and consultation as people who are employed by companies on the continent could be a good thing.
We could pass those rights into British legislation for people employed in Britain, and they probably apply to people employed in subsidiaries of our companies abroad anyway.
Paul Fry,
exactly. Now, the point he's making there is that these employees in the continent get those rights, the employees in Britain do not. Right. Now, most people in Britain don't think that a fair deal
you don't need to pass the social chapter to do that. If you're in government, you can do it yourselves.
Right, I want to hear from someone who does believe in the social chapter. Paul Fry, you work for a footwear company. You would like to see the social chapter incorporated?
Yeah, I think that there might be a misunderstanding of what's been said so far, that this country is full of good employers. You know, there are some employers that just won't pay minimum rates and minimum standards. And we want to see things passed in Europe so that we have the opportunity. We have the opportunity to talk to our employers. And something like the parental leave agreement, which is basically talking about 3 months of unpaid leave over an 8-year period, you know, it's hardly sort of some sort of left-wing sort of policy that we should be putting into place. It's just sort of common sense. You know, and I think that there's no problem with it, and it won't cost a lot of money.
I want to ask Malcolm Rifkind this, whether you, as the party which claims to promote the family, is really comfortable with stopping people taking parental leave.
But that's a matter for the House of Commons to decide. The House of Commons is our elected parliament. Let Robin campaign to have that issue debated and decided by our own elected parliament. Because do remember, what the social chapter means is that for years to come, any proposal that the European Commission put forward, however much even the Labour government might disapprove of it, if it was in the area, the very big area, subject to majority voting, even if a Labour government opposed it, even if they didn't think it was good for Britain, they could be overruled by a majority of continental countries and have these measures which could destroy jobs in Britain imposed against the wishes of the House of Commons, against the wishes of all parties in Britain. Now, why do that? When Robin says that on the single currency, it is jobs that he will determine this issue by, why doesn't he determine the social chapter by jobs? He knows there are 4 million people unemployed in Germany, which has the social model of the continental kind from which the social chapter has been derived. Why import mass unemployment into this country?
This is fantasy, Jeremy. There are 50 companies in Britain that have introduced the European
Several
Works
thousand
Council.
that haven't.
There are 50 who have. Not a single one has dismissed a single employee.
Right, I want to hear from Germany now.
Lost as a result of signing up to the social chapter.
Sorry, it's Strasbourg. Sorry, Elmar Brok. I want to hear from a German politician. When Tony Blair says that he will sign up to the social chapter, but be sure in doing so that nothing under that social chapter goes through which promotes inflexibility, is he going to have that power? Or once he signs up, is he actually powerless?
No, he has that power because a lot of other countries think in the same way. We do not want to create your social policy which will destroy jobs. And I think if Britain would join, it can influence it in a proper way.
What do you make of these objections that you hear voiced from Britain, that signing up to the social chapter is going to cost jobs?
It does not cost jobs. Parental leave was not a piece of European legislation. It was negotiated and decided by a European Company Association, which made that agreement for that and proposed it to the European Union. And so the business decided parental leave on the continent. And if you see, for example, what's going on with social policy, Britain is national gross product per capita in place 11 in the European Union behind Italy. And I think we have, even with the social protocol, done a good job.
If you sign up to the social chapter, can you subsequently withdraw from it, or do you, in doing so, sign up to being involved with every decision that is made under it in future?
Yes, you cannot sign up and go out anymore, that's true, but you also, that is a general question, for monetary union and for the social protocol. I've heard that word, pick and choose. Can you think that we have a European Union where every 50 countries would follow such a strategy, pick and choose? It will destroy the European Union, and Britain has to make up its mind whether it wants to take the full responsibility of the European Union, wants to influence it in a proper way. But just the strategy of pick and choose is not the way how a union can develop.
So, Robin Cook, effectively what you're signing up to is that you're signing a blank cheque.
No, we're not signing a blank cheque at all.
Well, you can't withdraw once you're in it.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I thought it was a very unreasonable question. You can't possibly say, look, we want to come along, we want to take part in this, but if we don't like it, we'll take our ball and go home. How on earth are you going to have credibility as a negotiator there? What we are saying...
You are bound to everything that is then passed under the social chapter, correct?
What happens if you join the social chapter, Jeremy?
You're not
is you can take
that.
part in the discussions. You have a voice. You have a vote. You can be there.
But you're not denying.
At present,
and then have to abide by everything that is passed.
We would negotiate what is coming in.
You
and
accept
record the British point of view, which is not being heard at the present
time. But you accept that you would then
there.
be bound by everything passed under the social chapter.
We would have to accept those things. But if I may say so, the particular point of concern to those business people out there is the question of the social security costs. Social security decision...
Well, hang on, you've heard from two business people here who've told you think it's a duff idea.
On the social chapter, they have their views. You have had other views here, and by the majority of 3 to 1, the British people want Britain to be in the social chapter, because actually, at the end of the day, they're not proud of a government of Britain that says we should have worse working conditions in Britain than anywhere else in Europe, Jeremy.
Charles Kennedy, very quickly.
It's a poverty of ambition, and it doesn't say much, I don't think, for the Foreign Secretary's view of how well this country, which is one of the big players in Europe, a net contributor, a great deal of economic and political clout, that things are going to be, to use the opening word, imposed on us. We can actually influence things in our direction. What a shame that we can't look at the opportunity in this way.
Let's move on now. The bottom line in this debate isn't about conditions at work or what currency we use. It's about how we make decisions about those things. It's about who calls the shots, whether Britain is any longer an independent sovereign nation. Before we talk about that, here are the views of 2 people on the subject.
I'm Mike Clark from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and I'm glad the European institutions have intervened to protect some of the things I value most. Just like the birds that live on the mudflats of the Isle of Sheppey, they come to feed here from all over the world, and this place is a key stage on their migration routes. But this is what can happen. This car park was built on another mudflat on Sheppey, destroying the homes of hundreds of wading birds. Narrow economic interests meant that a priceless natural resource was lost forever. We can't just assume that our national government will do enough to protect the environment. Recently, the RSPB challenged the government's decision to allow this to happen at the European Court of Justice. The court ruled the government acted illegally in excluding this area from special protection status and for refusing to take anything other than economic factors into account. The court's decision will have profound implications for wildlife. Birds don't respect national frontiers, and we need international laws to protect them. The European Commission, through its directives on conservation, has provided these laws, and the European Court of Justice can ensure that governments like ours fulfil the legal obligations they've agreed to honour.
My name is Christopher Booker, and I'm a columnist on the Sunday Telegraph. Every week I report on the devastating impact the European community and its institutions are having on British life.
Most people still imagine that we're governed by Acts of Parliament passed here in Westminster, but that is no longer the case.
When our government passed an act to stop Spanish fishermen taking fish which had been allocated to us by Brussels, the European Court of Justice simply ruled that the act of the British Parliament was illegal.
MPs here increasingly have no power at all.
Whitehall houses some of the most important departments in the land, like the Ministry of Agriculture. But the officials who work here are just carrying out laws and decisions handed down by Brussels. Last year, during the BSE panic, the European Commission committed British taxpayers to paying £3,000 million for the destruction of healthy cattle. And our MPs didn't have to be consulted at all. This little building in Westminster looks harmless enough, but behind it lies all the power of what is now in many ways the government of Britain. These are the offices of the European Commission in London. The British people need to wake up to the fact that if they want to talk to someone who really has power to affect their lives, this is the door they should now be knocking at.
Now, Sheryll Murray, you're the wife of a Cornish fisherman. What do you think about the idea that more powers be given to Brussels?
Well, I think all those people who are arguing for the social chapter, the single currency, come along to the fishing ports around the coast and speak to the fishermen. They are an authority on what it's like to work inside of federal Europe. We've been operating within a federal system for 25 years. That is why the fishermen are calling to take back the competency over our fish stocks, which should be ours, and fish swim within our 200-mile limit. They were given away in 1972, and the British fishermen are actually being told to scrap their boats, burn them, give up your licences for a pittance, while the Spanish fleet are allowed to come in, any other European fleet are allowed to come in and fish in those waters.
those fish stocks actually belong to the British people, or they should do.
You're directing that, maybe it's just because it's in your line of view at Charles Kennedy, a man who believes deeply in a federal Europe, don't you?
Yes, and also lives in an area where fishing's very important. So I understand. Well,
your constituency.
Well, if you just allow me, I'll answer the question. I think there's 2 points. The common fisheries policy clearly doesn't work and should be replaced by a system of regional fisheries.
How are you going to do it?
Well, if you just allow me, I'm just trying to tell you what the policy is, then I'll say how we'll do it. So we want to replace it. It could have been recast when Britain last had the presidency of the Union, but unfortunately, some deal was done with Spain, which we've never found out on the part of the government, which didn't result in a proper renegotiation of the CFP. So we want to go down the regional fisheries policy route, but I fear that we would have less clout and less ability at the end of the day, longer term, for vital interests like fishing and others, if we were simply to abrogate and withdraw.
George Gardiner.
Yeah, well, this, of course, gets right to the heart of what the referendum party is all about. I mean, we think the promise of a referendum on a single currency, if governments reach that decision, it's only halfway there, and there's something of a sham. What you need is a referendum that covers all these issues. That referendum, it wouldn't stop the European Court overruling the House of Parliament.
Whether we ought to get out, don't you?
It wouldn't save the fishing industry. It wouldn't allow our farmers to sell their beef to overseas markets. It wouldn't do any of that. And we do need the British public to voice an opinion of what relationship they want with the rest of Europe.
Okay, we'll come to that in a second. But just before we come to it, there is the question of the extended competencies or powers in Europe. Now, what powers do you propose to give away, Robin Cook?
We don't propose to give away any powers.
Well, you propose to abolish qualified majority voting in social, industrial, regional and environmental policy.
That is not giving away powers, Jamie.
Yes, it is. It's removing the veto.
No, let's discuss the question of majority voting.
It's removing the veto.
Jamie, can I get a word in? If I may say so, first of all, the biggest extension of majority voting took place under the Conservatives when they brought in the single market. And the reason for that, which is going to be quite right to do it, is because if one country has a veto, then it blocks progress, it blocks reform. If I can take one specific
So you are
example,
giving away the British veto in those crucial areas.
We're wanting to achieve reform.
We're achieving unanimity to change the course of the Commission's proposals.
Yes.
The Council of Ministers can only deviate from a Commission proposal with the unanimous agreement of all 15 ministers.
But the Commission proposals always, first of all, are sounded out with government ministers. I mean, they don't appear out of the sky. But if I can come back to the question of reform, there are a number of very key areas we need to reform in Europe. The question of the structural funds, the cohesion funds, the issue of fraud. None of these are you're going to achieve in the principle of unanimity. We back, for instance, the proposal that's been put forward that those governments that fail to crack down on fraud on the European budget should be fined. If you do that by unanimity, nobody will ever be fined. You've got to do it by majority vote.
Malcolm Rifkind, why is there nothing in your manifesto about reducing the powers of Europe? There's nothing in it about reducing the powers.
Well, in fact, what we have put certain very crucial proposals. For example, for reforming the European Court of Justice. We have put forward proposals for ensuring that the Working Time Directive is not introduced under a false use of the health and safety legislation.
Nothing that proposes that Europe has less power.
Well, it depends what you're referring to when you say power. What we recognize is that we are members of the European Union. If you are members of the European Union, you have to work as part of that organization. What we are not prepared to do is to transfer new powers to the European Union, and we are not prepared to surrender Britain's ability to veto legislation that would destroy jobs in this country and destroy prosperity.
Teresa, Gorman, you were saying here when George Gardiner, who's not actually a member of your party anymore, by the way, was speaking a moment ago. He's supposed to be a competitor. But you share his beliefs, but basically, do you?
I believe that the British people should be given the chance to decide where they want to go with this European experiment. They will tell you, and everyone's bored to death hearing, that we signed up for a trade organisation. We've got a lot more than we bargained for, and the British people have never been asked. And it is a great sorrow to me that my party doesn't take the lead role in that, because I believe we would win the election hands down and wipe out the Labour Party, perhaps forever.
Mrs. Ewing in Inverness, how does all this talk strike you?
Well, I'm becoming very irritated listening to people talking about the fishing industry, because the record of some of the members who are talking from your panel don't stand up to scrutiny. And I think anyone who's interested in the fishing industry, and I don't need to visit a fishing port, I live in one, and I know exactly the problems. And I find it fascinating, just listening to that particular debate, And I also learned that quota hopping, for example, which the fishing minister said he would go right to the wire on in the IGC, has now been dropped from the IGC agenda. So he didn't even reach the wire. So I wonder exactly what is happening there. It's important that we have the repatriation of the fishing industry, the management of the fishing industry.
Sorry to cut across you. Just tell us, has it been dropped or not?
I can say categorically on behalf of the government that we are insisting on satisfactory measures to ensure that the Spanish cannot continue to use the British quota. That was not what was intended when it was negotiated, and the intergovernmental conference is a very good way of getting that changed. If it can be changed in some other means, we're equally happy.
Fine.
But it's got to be changed.
Right. Elmar Brok, there is an inevitable tendency in the European Union, isn't there, towards greater European powers?
Yes, but it has always checked whether it's needed to do it on the European level.
Sure.
We have a lot of questions.
Okay. Now, if that's the case, sorry to cut across you, but if that's the case, is it possible to do as both the major parties here think they can do, to be part of it while acting as a brake? I mean, isn't the process inevitable? You're only travelling in one direction.
No, you have to be full member and take all the responsibilities, the advantages and the risk of the membership. And you cannot just pick a part of it.
Robin Cook, doesn't that just show you're in the same mess as the Conservatives are in?
No, if I may say so, Jeremy, I don't actually think that you're going to go anywhere if all you want to be is a brake. I want to get my hands on the steering wheel. I want to try and influence the direction in which Europe travels. And I do think that between us, we can achieve reform.
And you get that by giving up the veto in crucial areas, do you?
Well, you cannot reform in some areas unless you can overcome the veto of the other 14 members, Jeremy. Remember, you're not just talking about a veto for Britain. If you retain unanimity in those areas, you're talking about a veto, not just the present members, you're talking about a veto for the Czech Republic, maybe for Slovakia, possibly for Cyprus. If you'll get that, you will get no decisions made that are going to hurt any one country. You will not get the reform Europe needs. We want to be a leading player, not just standing in the side.
Robin has to realise that by giving up the veto, to use his own analogy, he's going to have a motor vehicle with a steering wheel and no brake.
Right.
That motor vehicle will crash.
And your real problem is that there are a large number of members of your party, like Teresa Gorman, who think you're addressing completely the wrong issue.
No,
they think
don't.
what you ought to be doing. No, she's told you.
No,
that's not.
Let me speak. I would much rather be with Malcolm at any time of the day or night than with Robin, because Malcolm does know where he's going. Yes, because these decisions are made at night behind closed doors.
And
can we just
on that very tasteful note, I think we will leave it. Thank you all very much. Thank you. We recorded that debate a little earlier. Now, before we go, a quick look at today's other news stories. There's a boost for the Conservatives tonight, with a new opinion poll suggesting a 12-point reduction in Labour's lead. The Murray poll for tomorrow's Times puts Labour on 49, the Conservatives on 34, the Liberal Democrats on 12. The Tories and Lib Dems are up from Murray's last poll at the expense of Labour. A Gallup poll in the Telegraph suggests a Labour lead of 23 points at 53, with the Conservatives on 30, the Lib Dems on 11, much in line with Gallup's figures of the last few weeks. In football, Manchester United have lost the first leg of their European Champions League semi-final against Borussia Dortmund 1-0. But they still have the chance to qualify for the final in the return game at Old Trafford in 2 weeks' time. An apology now. Last night on the programme we said that Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party, had in their manifesto promised to create 1,000 new jobs. That figure should have read 100,000 jobs. We apologise for the missing 999,000. And tomorrow morning's newspapers, Blair punctures Tories' tax, lies the Morning Star, but the rest of them more critical. Tories target Blair, Labour undecided on windfall tax scope. Tories smell blood as new Labour wobbles. Labour poll lead slashed by the Tories. And the Daily Telegraph News at the National Trust is planning to ban stag hunting. That's all for Newsnight tonight. You can see more election coverage on BBC 2 tomorrow with the campaign roadshow after the 3 o'clock news. I'll be back here with more tomorrow night. Until then, from all of us on the programme, night-night.